Who killed Lacey?
Yeah, there was a burglary across the street from my home. There were a lot of people off her. And I believe that Lacey went over there to see what was going on. That's where she was taken.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most fill-in-the-blank voice in true crime. In this analysis, we're going to examine 6 reasons why Scott's theory doesn't make any sense. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, if you're interested in me covering the Shroud of Turin, is it authentic, isn't it? Then you might want to fasten your seatbelts for that. I'll be covering that in the next analysis. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
I regret not testifying. I have a chance to show people what the truth is.
And that's number 1. He didn't bring it up in court. Scott had a chance to speak. He had many chances to speak, but the reason Scott didn't speak during his own murder trial is because he is a terrible speaker. The Netflix series shows in detail how when Scott changed his mind and decided to engage with the media, like Burke Ramsey in 2016, it was an unmitigated disaster. Virtually no one believed him on television. He came across really badly, didn't have much credibility. He just wasn't very believable. And so Scott's chances of surviving a blistering cross-examination in front of a jury in a courtroom were virtually null as well. You would also think if you were on trial for a murder that you didn't commit, you would be falling over yourself to tell the cops, to tell the media, and to tell the court who you think did it. So why didn't Scott?
Are you out of your fucking mind?
And I must say, it's sometimes hard watching those interviews. He's sort of seems to be very sleepy. He's got this very watery way of talking. It's very sort of breathy and weird. It just really is very, very strange. But the other thing is, number 2, is lawyers didn't bring it up in court either. You might say there are plenty of defendants on trial for murder who don't take the stand, but that still doesn't explain why, if this was such incontrovertible evidence, Scott's own glitzy, top-of-the-line lawyers didn't mention the burglary either. I have some obvious ideas why they didn't, which I'll share in a moment. Number 3, he never mentioned it to Diane Sawyer. Did Scott know about the burglary from day one? If so, why didn't he mention it to Diane Sawyer or Gloria Gomez? In fact, there's only one thing you tend to get used to with Scott. It's not what he tells you, it's what he leaves out. And you remember what Diane Sawyer observed back in 2003.
I noticed during the interview he had not yet talked about something.
You haven't mentioned your son.
It's so hard.
Well, maybe it was also so hard talking about the burglars. Number 4, why take 22 years to say what really happened? I don't think Scott knew all along about the burglary or saw the burglary as an alibi or an alternative from the beginning. I think, like the broken basement window in the Ramsey case, it sort of emerged after the fact as a possibility, and an unlikely one at that. And so over time, Scott has jumped on it. Funnily enough, in the Amanda Knox case, there's a staged burglary, and I believe even the court found that the burglary was staged. That was done to make it look like someone who was in the middle of a burglary started to do something else. And so one wonders where that idea came from. Number 5, it doesn't explain away Scott's strange behavior. Now, we'll deal with the absurdities of the burglary in a moment, but for the sake of argument, and it's really a stupid-ass argument.
But given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it. Direct.
And that's really what we should do here. But let's say that Scott is innocent in all this. Then why did he lie? Why did he hide away his boat? Why did he hide the affair? Why did he lie about his marriage? Why did he act weird to the media and act weird in general? And it goes on and on and on. I know people often say you can't judge whether someone is innocent or guilty simply by their effect, but it provides the first intuitive clue, and we see all of the same things here with Scott that we saw with Chris Watts. The nonchalance, the deception, the lack of emotion about his family. And we have some of these same gripes with, to some extent, the Ramseys, also complaints about strange behavior or unusual behavior. We have some similar gripes with the McCanns. Strange behavior, sometimes lack of emotion. And in terms of this case, why was everyone far more invested in what had happened to Lacey than he was? Similar to everyone was far more invested in what had happened to Shanann and the kids than Chris Watts was. Seemed like they'd both forgotten to really care about what was going on. That brings us to number 6. Why doesn't he mention the burglary to Amber Fry? Amber asked Scott in not one but several of those infamous recorded conversations to explain what happened. But he says he can't, or he says once Lacey's found, he'll be able to tell her in person. What would be so hard about mentioning the burglary to her then? Was he trying to protect them, the burglars, from the integrity of the investigation?
You cannot have a protagonist without desire. It doesn't make any sense. Any fucking sense.
And I think that is what Scott is pretending to be, is pretending to have an affair, but he didn't really care about Amber. He pretends to be very involved in his marriage to Lacey, but doesn't really get involved in the search for her and doesn't really show any emotion. But yes, no, he misses her and he says all the right words. But ultimately, he's just not showing any real desire, he's just showing really no emotion, and that's what's wrong. So Scott has said, I didn't kill my family, and he says, don't trust me, look at the evidence. Well, let's do that. Does his theory of what happened make sense? Now, the extended version of all that is to say, okay, let's look at the evidence. Well, let's look at the burglars, and yeah, they are. Stephen Todd and Donald Pierce, both were drug addicts. They were burglarizing not just one place, but several. And they actually came forward to say, hey, it was us, and we had nothing to do with the murder. And they were burglarizing in order to fund their drug habit. So relatively low-level criminality taking place. Does Scott ever mention either of these men by name? Well, he can't, because he can't accuse them directly, because he doesn't have any evidence. There's no fingerprints, there's no DNA, there's no evidence. And so he talks about evidence and complains that the case against Lacey is circumstantial evidence. But saying the burglars killed Lacey when she walked over, when she was too exhausted to even walk the dog, isn't only circumstantial, but circumstantially weak, bordering on illogical. And correlation does not equal causation. Just because burglars were there, just because Gary Oliva was in Boulder and Bruckner in Praia de Luz at the same time that Madeline disappeared, that doesn't make someone else a prime suspect. Just because you can find one other criminal in an area doesn't suddenly make them the perpetrator. That is a very fragmented, disconnected way of thinking. But of course, what this all is about is a defense desperate to find some little crack in the case, some sort of way to sort of try and worm in some possible doubt. Think about it. Burglars and drug addicts have motives, and their motives are for money and drugs. And we see this with Christian Bruckner. Murder is a completely different kettle of fish. At 34:35 in episode 3, one of the jurors from the Peterson trial makes a surprisingly astute comment. He says that Peterson couldn't be convicted on a single piece of evidence, but on the totality. And in that sense, the circumstantial evidence in the Peterson case is quite compelling.
The Scott Peterson case, you can't take a part of it and look at it and say, aha, because there is no aha moment. But you take the bits and pieces and you put them all together, then it draws a picture.
Scott would say there were a lot of people in that burglary. Well, as far as I know, there were only 2. And he says, and I believe that Lacey went over there to see what was going on. And that's when she was taken. He also said that investigators ignored evidence in that incident to hone in on his guilt. Well, people do tend to ignore evidence when it doesn't take you anywhere, when it's not real evidence. I also can't help feeling that someone has been watching how the Baldwin case was thrown out, and some defendants are kind of rubbing their hands and kind of sensing an opportunity here, getting cynical ideas to use the same technique to get Scott off based on a technicality, based on this false premise of handing over evidence with dubious value and then saying, oh, because you didn't do that, that jeopardized the fairness of your case. And of course, his lawyers did have evidence about the burglary, they just elected not to use it. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say in the next episode, we'll return to the Netflix narrative, continue unpacking that, and deal with why Scott changed his mind and spoke to the media for the first time while Lacey was missing, and why it was such a disaster. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.